You had argued after voting to acquit the former president that presidents are not immune from prosecution. Is that still your view?
Well, my view of the presidential race is that I choose not to get involved in it and comment about any of the people running for the Republican nomination.
Leader McConnell, thank you. You talk about the need for a CR here. Explain operationally, despite there being a top line, how it's so challenging to get something done by the end of next week. But secondarily, and perhaps more importantly, are you and Speaker Johnson not aligned on this? I mean, he has said he doesn't want to do a CR. You say that's the only way out of this mess right now in the next week.
Well, they have a top-line agreement, Schumer and the Speaker. In the meantime, we need to prevent a government shutdown. And so the obvious question is, how long does the CR need to be? And that'll be up to the majority leader and the Speaker to determine the length of the CR. But the Senate, the simplest things take a week in the Senate. So I think frequently the House doesn't understand how long it takes to get something through the Senate. Alex?
In light of the anniversary of January 6th, is it accurate to characterize individuals convicted and incarcerated for January 6th related crimes, to characterize them as hostages? Is that accurate?
Well, let me say this about January 6th. I had remarks that I made on February 13th of 21 about how I felt about January 6th. I recently reread it. I stand by what I said.
Secretary Austin, do you believe he should resign?
Leader McConnell. Good afternoon. I know you've had your problems with former President Trump here, but if he continues to do well in the primaries and more Republican members of Congress continue to endorse him, will that appear strange if you, the top Republican in the Senate, are not endorsing him for president?
Well, I don't have any announcement to make on the presidential election. In fact, you all may recall I've stayed essentially out of it, and when I change my mind about that, I'll let you know.
With election year politics heating up, at what point does this Ukraine border package have to get done before it gets subsumed by election year politicking?
Months ago. Obviously, I think you already know how strongly I feel about the international challenges that we have and our need to address them. I also feel that way about our southern border. We are working hard, continuously, to try to get a solution on the border part of it. I think this is the ideal time to do it. I think all of you know the politics around here. If this were not divided government, we wouldn't have an opportunity to do anything about the border. In fact, I don't think we'd get 60 votes for any border plan if we had a fully Republican government. So this is a unique opportunity where divided government has given us an opportunity to get an outcome. Virtually all of my members have said to their constituents for a long time, we need to fix the border. This administration is not going to do it unless we force them to, and we're going to continue to press to try to get an outcome that we can put on the floor, that the majority leader can put on the floor in connection with all of these other problems that need to be addressed by the #1 country in the world who elects its own leaderships.
Leader McConnell, just to follow up, do you feel you need to mend your relationship with the former president if he wins the nomination?
I don't have any news to make today. We're all watching New Hampshire with great interest.
Leader McConnell, do you?
Let me add one thing. We had a lot of discussion, obviously, about the border around here, but it's important to focus on the other rationale for the supplemental. We've got two friends in the middle of a huge fight, Israel, Ukraine. They need help. And hopefully we can work this border issue out in a way that's satisfactory. But there's bipartisan support here in the Senate for both Israel and Ukraine. and hopefully at some point we'll get them the help that they need.
Leader McConnell,
Yeah.
that said, you know, we thought we were going to have something on Ukraine, this international aid package back in the fall. You made it conditional for aid to Ukraine to have this border security piece here. Looking back at how long and how tedious these negotiations are, was that a mistake to marry these two things together?
Well, it's certainly been a challenge to try to reach an agreement on the border. That's why we've been talking about this so long. I always thought it would be a challenge, and it has been. But it's time for us to move something, hopefully including a border agreement. But we need to get help to Israel and to Ukraine quickly.
Leader McConnell.
Alex?
Would you support proceeding on a Ukraine border security deal if it didn't have support of at least a majority or half of your conference?
I don't know how it's going to end up being presented, and we'll see what the final package looks like.
Leader McConnell,
Yeah,
how do you think how do you think voters would look at Republicans if the GOP were to kill a bipartisan deal that you cut with the White House because of Donald Trump's opposition?
Well, I think I'm going to continue not to comment on the presidential campaign. Obviously, this is an incredibly challenging political discussion we've been having. I still favor trying to make law when you can. And I do think that what Senator Langford and his team are going to produce is an improvement over current law. You're asking me a question I can't answer right now, which is what is the fate of it.
Leader McConnell, on the tax deal, do you support that? If it came over here?
Over the weekend, Senator endorsed Trump, the other lieutenant senator endorsed Trump. Why are you voting out to endorse
I don't have any announcement of that today.
Leader McConnell, you spoke about the speaker being optimistic to move more bills, but what do you see the path in this short period of time to avoid a shutdown? I mean, is the Senate going to wait for the House, or are we going to wait past the deadline a little bit on Friday night?
I think we're getting close on the first 4 bills. Hopefully that won't require another short-term CR, and hope springs eternal.
Senator Newman just said that he would support a full Senate trial for Alejandro Mayorkas, chairman of the Senate. Do you also support a full Senate trial for Mayorkas?
I think that would be the best way to go forward, yeah.
Mr. Leader, could you talk about Speaker Johnson's position on the supplemental in that meeting with the president? Did it seem as though he's prepared to bring Ukraine into the House?
You can ask the Speaker about his views. I give you mine, you're familiar with them. What I hope is that the House will take up the Senate bill and let the House work its way. If they change it and send it back here, we have further delays. Not only do we not want to shut the government down, we don't want the Russians to win in Ukraine. And so we have a time problem here. And the best way to move quickly and get the bill to the president would be for the House to take up the Senate bill and pass it.
Mr. Leader,
How do you reconcile your Trump endorsement with the fact that you called him practically and morally responsible for January 6th, and the fact that he insulted you and your wife repeatedly?
On February the 25th, 2021, shortly after the attack on the Capitol, I was asked a similar question, and I said I would support the nominee for president even if it were the former president.
Leader McConnell, in April of last year, you indicated, you didn't really directly answer the question as to whether or not you were comfortable with Mr. Trump if he was in the middle of criminal trials and indictments, he was the nominee. I presume that means you're comfortable with him.
I don't have anything to add to what I just said. I said in February of 2021, shortly after the attack on the Capitol, that I would support President Trump if he were the nominee of our party, and he obviously is going to be the nominee of our party. Alex?
Leader McConnell, most of your Republican colleagues would say you had a very effective 17 years as Republican leader. What do you think about this new idea of putting term limits on the Senate Republican leader?
Well, we have term limits now. They're called elections. And I had a contest myself during my last election as leader. I think the conference ought to be able to be free to choose whoever. There's no limit on the speaker or the other House leaders. That won't be my decision to make, but I think it's totally inappropriate.
Will you endorse a candidate in the leadership race to succeed you?
No, I'm not. Okay.
The former president has called the January 6th prisoners hostages, patriots, and promised to pardon them if he wins again. Is that appropriate?
I'm going to avoid talking about the presidential election. It's going on pretty darn early, and I think a better pattern for me is to do my job here.
Leader McConnell,
Chad.
I know we're waiting for the House of Representatives to move this minibus spending bill. There's not much time over here, but considering that this is probably more than $1 trillion, who knows how many earmarks, how much time do members need to do due diligence on a bill like that when we're up against a deadline?
Well, first is a commitment over on the House side, unless they waive it, to have it out for 72 hours. So my assumption, and what I've told our members, is we're likely to be here this weekend. That will be determined, however, by how long it stays in the House. And when it's over here, what we have recently done, and I think hopefully will work again, is that in return for a certain number of amendments, we can finish it quicker, hopefully, than putting us in a position of shutting down the government.
There appears to be some traction for the idea of making some of the Ukraine money a loan that's perhaps forgivable and can be waived. Are you open to that approach at this point?
What I've said repeatedly is we're running out of time. And the best way to get Ukraine the help they need is for the House to pass the Senate bill. The problem with changing it, as you all know, it can take you 3 days to do the simplest thing here in the Senate. We don't have the time. So I'm continuing to advocate to the Speaker that he put the bill on the floor and let people vote.
Leader McConnell, will you ask?
Leader McConnell, do you agree with former President Trump's statement that Israel is absolutely losing the PR war? And speaking of the military operation in Gaza, you've got to get it over with. You have to get back to normalcy.
My view is when you have a Democratic ally, somebody we're closely aligned with, I don't think it's appropriate for us to give them advice about whether to have an election or what their military strategy ought to be. They didn't start this war, and I'm hopeful that they'll be able to achieve their goal, which is to eliminate Hamas from being able to govern and effectively control Gaza.
Legacy if the next president is Trump, who has encouraged Putin to invade our NATO allies if they don't contribute enough to defense spending.
I'm sorry, what's your question?
What is your legacy if the next president is Trump, who has encouraged Russia to invade our NATO allies if they don't contribute enough to defense spending?
We can speculate all day about what might happen or what might not happen. I'm going to consistently avoid discussing the presidential election. I got one job as I give up my leader position, that's to create a Republican majority in the Senate, and I'm going to confine my political observations to taking the Senate back.
Leader McConnell, thank you. You've been probably one of the most ardent backers of
Just following up on that a minute, I was at the Derby this weekend. I was with one of these university presidents, and he indicated that roughly 40% of the people creating these problems were not students there. Clearly there's interference from outside, and this whole situation seems to me has been best dealt with by our former colleague Ben Sass, who had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in the last few days pointing out that they were not a children's display area. They clearly have rules and they enforce them.
Leader McConnell.
Sure.
Thank you. Good afternoon. You've been outspoken about your disappointment in Congress being unable to advance some sort of an immigration border security package here. There are some Democrats, moderate Democrats, now saying the president should take executive action here. What would you like to see if he were to do that? Because you even have these moderate Democrats speaking out.
Well, obviously, I'm not an advisor to the president, but if I were, I'd say you ought to do something about this to the maximum extent of your ability. Obviously, the previous administration had more success controlling the border, and so there must be more this administration can do, not just blame Congress for not passing legislation.
Senator Patty Murray is insisting, reiterating that Democrats will want dollar-for-dollar parity on non-defense and defense. Can you accept that, given that you're seeking a substantial defense increase?
Yeah, no, I can't accept that at all. If you look at the request for defense from the administration, not a single one of their requests since they've been there has even kept up with inflation. In case anybody hadn't noticed, we have two major competitors, the Russians and the Chinese. We have the Iranians, and we have their proxies. This is the most dangerous time since the world and since the Berlin Wall came down, and the defense spending needs to reflect the needs of our country, which clearly argues against having an arbitrary line that doesn't spend more on defense than domestic. So I certainly do disagree with that, and we're going to have a vigorous discussion about it.
Leader McConnell.
Yeah.
Given all the allegations that have come out against the former president in the criminal hush money trial, including covering up an alleged affair with Stormy Daniels, does it give you any pause in supporting him for president?
Look, I have said to you all, and basically to you every week, that I don't blame you for trying, but I'm not going to be commenting on the presidential election. I'm going to concentrate on trying to turn this job over to the next majority leader of the Senate.
The Speaker was at New York yesterday saying that the former president's trial is a sham of a trial, a travesty of justice, and was done intentionally to keep him there. Do you agree with the Speaker?
Tries every week, doesn't he? Look, I've made it clear I'm going to focus on getting the Senate majority back, and I think we've taken a big step toward that yesterday in West Virginia, and I'll be happy to take another question.
Leader McConnell, the Republican group One Nation is putting $70 million into Senate races, Senate battlegrounds, but not Maryland. Where do you think Maryland ranks on the list of likely Republican pickups, and do you think Republicans need to put more money into that race?
Well, as you know, that's an outside group. I recommend you call them for comment. Well, in what has become a weekly tradition, Manu?
Now that you have not weighed in about your support for Donald Trump in the aftermath of this conviction, now that he is a convicted felon, are you 100% behind him?
What I said last week, I will say again. This is a case that never should have been brought in the first place, and I think will be overturned on appeal.
Are you supporting him? Are you supporting him? As you probably know, some of your Republican colleagues are circulating a letter asking for signatures, basically pledging not to confirm any Biden political appointees or judicial nominees, or to work with Democrats on anything not related to national security. What's your reaction to that?
The solution is to have a Republican majority, and then we'd be in a position to determine what the agenda was going to be. There are opportunities when you're in a minority, but not to set the agenda.
Yeah, the RNC co-chair criticized Larry Hogan's response to the Trump verdict last week. Did you think that was appropriate for her to do?
Well, what I think is we need more Republican members of the Senate, and whether you're Mike Lee or whether you're Susan Collins, we need more Republicans in order to set the agenda. So obviously I support all the Republican candidates, and certainly Governor Hogan would be among them.
Come November.
Should we continue the tradition?
Tomorrow you're going to the NRSC. First time you haven't spoken to Trump since December 2020, from what we understand. You kind of confront any of the bad blood between the two of you, or any of the issues you had including over January 6th?
You know, I said 3 years ago, right after the Capitol was attacked, that I would support our nominee, regardless of who it was, including him. I've said earlier this year, I support him. He's been earned the nomination by the voters all across the country. And of course, I'll be at the meeting tomorrow. Alex?
Some of your colleagues are talking about using budget reconciliation next year to plus up defense spending in line with what Roger Wicker's talked about, also tackling some mandatory spending to help reduce the deficit. What are your thoughts on those ideas?
Well, look, all of that is a very complicated subject. What we do know for sure is the first step is to have an NDAA that reflects the needs of the military now, based upon world conditions that Senator Ernst was talking about, I was talking about. How to achieve that is very complicated. But let me just say the first step is we need to have a Republican president, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, or there'll be no reconciliation at all. And it is an important tool. We hope to have an opportunity to use it, and we'll find out the first Tuesday in November.
Did he say anything about you?
Nope.
Did you talk to him directly?
Huh?
Did you talk to him directly?
Yeah, but we shook hands a few times. He took questions from the audience, and it was an entirely positive session.
What was his message?
Did you talk about his conviction? You had to say to him, Senator?
Now, on another matter, last week the Supreme Court concluded its term with a number of consequential decisions. 3 of these rulings and the reactions they triggered on the left illustrate just how differently Republicans and Democrats view the court's role. As I've explained before, Republicans want government that is accountable to the people, as the Constitution prescribes. Democrats, on the other hand, want government that is insulated from the democratic process. Here's the democratic ideal of how to govern. If Congress has not spoken on an issue, let unelected bureaucrats manipulate statutes, fill in the blanks, and make new law. Then if anyone violates these new bureaucratic-made laws, let the bureaucrats take them to a bureaucratic court, not to a jury or a real judge, but to a kangaroo court of other bureaucrats who answer to still more bureaucrats. And finally, if the president, the one actor in the executive branch who answers to the people, dares to interfere in this process in ways that bureaucrats don't like, let him face criminal charges from yet another group of bureaucrats. It's dystopian. It's something you'd find in the law books of the old Soviet Union. And the Supreme Court said they'd have none of it. In what might be the most consequential decision in my time here, the Supreme Court held that bureaucrats do not get the benefit of the doubt when they write new laws. Congress writes laws, and the ways bureaucrats apply those laws are subject to full judicial review. There's no get out of legislative free card, no Chevron deference, period. The court also held that when the Constitution says you have a right to a jury trial, it means just that. Just because bureaucrats decide to pursue someone for ruinous fines, they don't get to try the case themselves. When bureaucrats go after someone, potentially for violating rules that Congress never even contemplated, the case has to go to a real Senate-confirmed judge and a jury of one's peers. Lastly, the court clarified something that careful readers of the Constitution have known forever. Bureaucrats can't criminally charge a president for his official actions. The Constitution vests in the president executive powers that cannot be circumscribed, not by Congress and not by inventive prosecutors. Democrats seem to want to turn Washington into The Hague. Their problem with the Supreme Court isn't that they won't be able to prosecute a president for unofficial criminal activity, because they still can. Their problem is that they won't be able to prosecute official actions that they don't like. Prominent Democrats seem to look at the successful criminalization of political disagreement in places like Europe and South America and think they might just be onto something. It's not hard to imagine what's coming. We've already seen hints in the reports of the Inspector General investigating entirely appropriate conduct by Attorney General Barr that Democrats simply disagreed with. Why should Democrats stop there? As Chief Justice Roberts explained, quote, without immunity, prosecutions of ex-presidents could quickly become routine. The enabling of the presidency and our government that would result from such a cycle of factional strife is exactly what the framers intended to avoid. I certainly agree. The people elect the president. He's responsible to them for his official conduct, not to bureaucrats with law licenses. So, Madam President, we're not just talking about two sorts of reaction to the Supreme Court's latest rulings. We're talking about two very different visions of America. A democratic vision in which bureaucrats decide our policy disputes and have the power to punish those elected officials who dare to disagree. And a constitutional vision in which policy is entrusted broadly to the people through representative democracy. Suffice it to say that Republicans prefer the latter.
Mr. Leader.
Well, I think I'll continue the weekly tradition.
Senator, when you were gone, the Supreme Court ruled in the immunity case. Do you agree with the decision granting immunity to the former president for actions he took while in office?
What the Supreme Court actually did was lay out the parameters, but not apply them to this particular case. They sent it down to the lower courts to find facts rather than making up facts that were not actually before the court yet. So, yes, I'm completely comfortable with it.
Mitch McConnell.
Since the Senate last convened, our nation has seen two attempts to circumvent the American people's right to choose their leaders. The first, of course, was the first time in more than a century that a former president of the United States was shot in an attempted assassination. That happened to Theodore Roosevelt. This murderous assault on our democratic process very nearly robbed millions of Americans of their choice for the next president. It's been reassuring to see Americans united in their horror at this brazen act of political violence. The near disaster on July 13th violated the trust of the American public, and restoring that trust will require transparency and accountability. I said at the outset that the resignation of the Director of Secret Service would be an important step in that direction. And I'm encouraged she's taken that step today. The director is on record describing her agent's responsibilities as, quote, a zero-fail mission, end quote. Clearly, on July 13th, the Secret Service did fail the mission. The important questions now are why and how, apart from internal inquiries and FBI investigations, Congress Oversight Authority entitles us to answers. Yesterday, the House Oversight Committee spent hours questioning the director of the Secret Service. Unfortunately, the Senate majority hasn't yet showed any intention of conducting oversight of its own. Democrats who so often express concern about threats to democracy have yet to look seriously at the failures of the Secret Service. The Judiciary Committee, for its part, appeared to be more concerned with resurrecting failed judicial nominations than in getting to the bottom of the first near assassination of a former president in 100 years. Until earlier today, Chairman Durbin apparently intended to spend the committee's time taking another look at radical Judge Sarah Netburn, a nominee his own committee rejected once for engaging in political activism from the bench and lying about her actions under oath. It's crickets at the Homeland Security Committee as well. Chairman Peters has 3 meetings on the calendar for this week, but not one about the near assassination of a former president. The former president of the United States came within an inch of his life just days ago. An innocent participant in the great tradition of American campaigns was killed, and 2 other attendees were seriously wounded. The American people deserve to know how this happened and what steps are being taken to ensure that it won't happen again.
After the NATO summit, President Trump invited Viktor Orban down to Mar-a-Lago. Is that a mistake, given that Orban has repeated Russian talking points and propaganda?
Well, I can tell you how I feel about Viktor Orban. He's the one member of NATO who's essentially turned his country over to the Chinese and the Russians, has been looking for ways to undermine NATO's efforts to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. So Viktor Orban, I think, has now made Hungary the most recent problem in NATO. We used to think of the Turks as sort of being never quite with the team. I think Orban has replaced the Turks, and is clearly the weakest member of NATO.
Do you support the House strategy to push government funding until March and also include the SAVE Act in there? Or do you agree with Leader Schumer that this is going to result in a shutdown?
Well, I think we first have to see what the House sends us, and then, of course, how to handle that will be up to the majority leader. I would remind you, I've been both. Majority's better. But the first step ought to be what comes out of the House, and I think we don't know right now.
Having seen a lot of these government funding battles yourself, there are some Republicans who argue the SAVE Act is worth risking a shutdown just 5 weeks before the election. Do you think that could jeopardize Republican prospects?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you think a government shutdown, if it happens over the SAVE Act, could jeopardize Republican prospects in the election?
A government shutdown is always a bad idea, at any time.
Donald Trump just posted on Truth Social that he believes that Republicans should shut down the government if they don't get the SAVE Act or election security passed ahead of the election. Do you agree with that?
Well, as I just said, shutting down the government is always a bad idea, no matter what time of year it is.
Mitch McConnell, your friend Dick Cheney over the weekend endorsed Kamala Harris. He called Trump the single biggest threat to the Republic in its history. Should Republicans listen to Dick Cheney, or is he wrong?
Well, you'd have to ask the Cheneys about that. Thank you.
You don't have any opinion on that?
That further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
It's dismaying to begin another week with news of an assassination attempt against a former president. We're certainly all grateful, once again, that the worst outcome was avoided. This ought to be a moment of soul-searching for all Americans. It's a time to reflect on the ways that our political process has been injected by reprehensible violence. In America, our democracy flows from the ballot box, not from the barrel of a gun, period. In the meantime, for the second time in as many months, law enforcement faces an even more urgent task, completing a thorough, swift, and transparent investigation into the circumstance of yesterday's close call. The American people deserve answers. They deserve assurance that a former president who tens of millions of Americans have nominated once again will receive every appropriate measure of security, and they ought to receive them without delay.